this panel is going to talk about is international development and data. And it's important because sometimes, even though in our minds data is data, we actually separate what is international, what is domestic, and thinking about how the international community, international development is using it, and where there might be lessons learned in this is actually a fairly important conversation. So with that, let me just quickly introduce all of our panelists, and then they're much like the last panel. Each one of them is going to talk for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. Please be ready for questions, and we're going to do questions, and we'll also do rapid-fire questions at the end to get as many questions in as possible. So directly to the left of me is Sean McDonald. He's the CEO of Frontline SMS Social Enterprise, the Social Impact Lab, and the founder of Frontline SMS Legal Project. Frontline SMS was one of the first platforms to harness the power of mobile technology for social change, and has recently become open source and is beginning to see sector-specific applications in Frontline SMS. And he'll talk a little bit about that. Next to him is Jed Miller. And I'm just going to describe the 5 words he uses for himself. This will be a great explanation of Jed. Digital strategy, human rights, transparency, humor, evangelist for realism. But that says a lot about Jed and his background. He's done a lot of work from everywhere from media to helping organizations think about how they use data, and he'll talk a little bit about that. And Agnieszka Rawa. She is the managing director for the Millennium Challenge Corporation's partnership with PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and has been at MCC and was also the managing director for Africa in the Department of Compact Operations. So she brings a significant amount of expertise, especially from an international development agency. And Andrew Zeitlin, he's the assistant professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. He's also a research associate at the Center for Study of African Economies at Oxford University and the lead academic for International Growth Center's Rwanda program. And he has, not only does he write about the use of data, but he also uses it in his research, uses theory-driven field and laboratory experimental methods. And he'll talk a little bit about the work that he's been doing in Africa, especially in Kenya and Uganda. So with that, I will start with you, Sean.
Hi. So Frontline SMS is a platform that basically connects text messaging to the internet and is used in a wide variety of online and offline circumstances to help digitize and then make operations, particularly social service operations, more effective. We have a footprint in about 150 countries and have been used for about 10 years. My background personally is in law, particularly international law. So running a technology company that sits at the edge of a lot of these issues ages me very quickly. And so we worry about everything. Some of our most powerful use cases, for example, have been in healthcare. Healthcare in places where HIPAA is not a thing, and where HIPAA does, where those data sets have to meet each other, you have all kinds of truly fascinating, but also truly terrifying legal liability questions. I think one of the reasons that I was invited to this is I also just did, so Frontline was used, like a case study of this, is Frontline was used in the recent response to Ebola in West Africa. And we were used by the United Methodist Church, which used its on-the-ground church network to provide significant amounts of counseling, behavior change support, and altering some of the rituals that were really adding to the, alter some of the burial rituals, essentially, which were really adding to the spread of the disease. The flow of information, the way that that project managed itself was difficult to quantify in terms of impact, but was truly powerful across its own network. And we saw a lot of that happen from a data perspective, but also from a very human-to-human perspective. I also did a research project about the law of the way that data was used during the Ebola response, and essentially the legality of it. And I will save you a lot of screaming and crying, but the short answer is that it's very complicated, and that there are a lot of really good organizations trying to do the best work possible that are in a very difficult situation because the law is very there and it's very real, and it's not quite tailored yet to the operational context. So it's starting with everything is fine and it's really simple and everything is great. I'll hand it over to Jed.
It only gets worse after this, by the way.
Well, thank you for having me. I'll go now. And thank you for having this event, and thank you also to Holly. think having worked on data or open data or digital strategy issues for a while, it's great to see that even in the inception institutions like the ones you are creating are trying to have a focus in realism. How do we actually reach these communities? What strategies and collaborations need to be in place? I think there's a huge opportunity to make that hope for practicality real, but I think it doesn't always happen. So hopefully we can talk about that and then carry this talk forward. Like they said last night, we can all be enlisted in actual collaborations or at least advice in the future. I tend to, in my work, advise people to not design according to the coolest technology that's available, but design according to the needs of groups that actually will be using those tools, or perhaps never even touching the tools, but benefiting from the information that those tools have helped you create or gather. And this is particularly true in the international context, where we see so much money going to applications of trendy data practices, and people forget what they call the last mile, and they send an SMS program in the dialect spoken in the capital rather than in the dialect spoken in the mining village. Or they create PDF files, but there's no color printers anywhere near where they're printing. So we need to be thinking in a design-centric way. And I also tend to advise organizations a lot, ones that I've worked within and ones that I consult to design according to the readiness of your own team to do the work. We've all had the story where a great consultant has come on board, or an amazingly expensive vendor or government contractor, and created amazing tools that once the vendor has shifted into a maintenance mode, or once your contractor has gone to the Peace Corps and not left you with the Twitter password, it's much harder to have the internal staff to do the work you need to do. So design for capacity, not just for opportunity. My own background is sort of a hybrid, working as a digital strategist, most recently with foundations and in the international in NGO space, and before that as digital director at the American Civil Liberties Union, so in the domestic context, and before that at the Times, at the New York Times website. But the challenges across those three kind of sectors have been remarkably similar, and I find they often have less to do with tech and more to do with challenges of collaboration. The tech is important, and we all have to learn as much as possible, but you don't need to learn GitHub. We have Andrew and the 538 team to understand how to use GitHub, and maybe your CTO or someone they hire can use GitHub. You need to understand, I think we all need to understand a little better how data can be applied to challenges like storytelling, or as Brian calls it, bullshit. How we can adapt our sector better in light of this new amazing proliferation of raw material, and how we can, most importantly, collaborate differently. So just two quick thoughts on that. One, if you've been on Facebook or social media over the last few days, you may have seen a red infographic. It's not really an infographic, it's just a quote from The Economist that says, of the 750,000 refugees resettled in the United States since 9/11, 2001, not one has been charged with terrorism. So that is data storytelling. And I think it's a great example of data storytelling, in particular because it's more likely to get used, because it's more relevant to what people are seeing around them in their lives and on the news right now. And it does not take anything except a good factoid. And that good factoid might have been technologically derived. I also want to think about our collaborative challenges, because I find that information is siloed often, as we've been talking about, in different data sets controlled by different organizations, or sometimes different ministries within the same country. You'll have people, as was it Zach who talked about was it Andrew? Somebody talked in the last panel about the excitement about traffic to a new data set, and it turns out it was all from within the building, because we are not sharing our own data well enough. But I think the collaborative challenge is deeper than a technology challenge. We gather and disperse, we do studies, then we report and we cry done. We post a proliferating number of data sets. We establish alliances and global partnerships, all focused on the same thing. And then we don't share data with each other. because to paraphrase Eugene O'Neill, we work as we dream alone. So how can we, using events like this and using the connections we make here, think about breaking not only silos of data, but silos of activity, silos of strategy, and silos of community? And I think that's the biggest opportunity we have here, particularly in light of things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the so-called data revolution. That's what I tend to push for, collaboration around the technology and more strategic design thinking around technology, because what we do when we ask technologists and people off in the 3 floors away from us in our building to help us with data visualization, to help us with data design, or even building a website, is much less when we only rely on consultants and government contractors, which is an addiction, and you can seek help. We're effectively outsourcing thought. And it's thoughtfulness about how these data tools can be used and how this wealth of massive data can be used that will create stronger, more design-centric, more user-centric, and more capacity-centric implementations.
Thank you for the gentler transition than the one you received from your neighbor. I assume most of you know that the Millennium Challenge Corporation is essentially in the business of achieving poverty reduction through sustainable economic growth. And so as an agency, we use data both to select the country partners that we work with, as well as to support the process of their designing the right investments, and then to learn from that process, to look at the impacts of the interventions. My background to this space is, interestingly, initially I was a molecular biologist, so I guess I think that the connection there is gene sequencing, DNA, lots of data, lots of information, and to make up human beings and other living species. But I'm actually not here to talk to you more about MCC or myself, but about pretty interesting collaboration that we have entered into with PEPFAR. It's a 3-year collaboration, and effectively, I wanted all of us to take a little step back. We've heard so many different things about what works, doesn't quite work in the data space. Data users, data generators, the systems supporting data, the tools. And I think the big challenge here is that we need to look at data as an ecosystem, not as a simple linear set of schematic, but rather an interconnecting set of causal loops and diagrams. So it definitely is complex. And for it to work holistically, the entire system needs to work, and we need to look at constraints within that system. And those might be different from place to place. And this is where a lot of the things that we heard about in the first panel are actually really even more accentuated in an international development arena. In many of the countries where both PEPFAR and MCC operate, in places in Africa, in East Africa, Tanzania, even in Kenya, where there's actually glimmers of hope in terms of how data is being applied. Really, the capacity of data users is extremely low, really low, let alone just the rate of literacy in those countries. And then it's even lower in rural areas, right? There is, in fact, interestingly, an oversupply of data relative to the use of that data. And of course, there are still individuals that don't even have cell phones. We hear that 80% of the world does have cell phones now. And it's a gap that will probably close fairly fast, but there's still 20% or so that do not have. And so in these places where MCC and PEPFAR operate, there are even more of those. And that has, I think, a tremendous implication. Because for that stakeholder group, and it is the stakeholder group that is a target for agencies like the MCC and often PEPFAR, the data revolution right now is still immaterial. Importantly, as a development practitioner for more than 20 years, I also want to bring your attention to what that is causing from the standpoint of ensuring programmatic effectiveness. it really hinders the very important and constructive feedback loop that is necessary. The feedback loop that I'm referring to is that connection between the investors, whether they're in the private sector, the governments that are trying to deliver services, or the individuals even, like farmers, trying to get information about market prices so that they can sell them at a better price. That feedback loop is necessary for investors to understand whether their program is as effective as they'd like it to be. It's important for transparency, for accountability, and ultimately for the sustainability of the investments. So what is this program or collaboration that we're working with PEPFAR? We are referring to it after several months of scoping and actually conversations at the country level with governments, with civil society, and the private sector to country data collaboratives for local impact. So really it is less about just the data itself, but about using the data. And the premise there, again, is that there is more data in many of these places than there's use of that data, and that the use of the data will help address some of the quality problems in that data, some of the gap problems, but importantly, why all of this? To achieve local impact, to really make a material difference in the quality of lives and well-being of the individuals that are our key stakeholders. The program will also be implemented in a way that's kind of consistent with the principles at MCC, which is that we want it to be as much as possible built on the foundations of the capacity that's existing in country. So I think many of you also probably share this feeling that the data and the systems that are in place in many cases are there to support whether it's the private sectors or different agencies, and MCC and PEPFAR are guilty of that as well, to support our own programmatic objectives. So this is an attempt to shift that balance, to call attention to the lack of in-country-based capacity and systems, and to challenge country-based stakeholders, governments, civil society, individual entrepreneurs, and those who at least have some capacity in those countries to focus on the demand side, on the users, on that market, and that paradigm shift that we heard about from the first panel. And also to shift it to the local level. So, you know, some of the other good news in the development arena is there has been more attention to the capacity of the national statistics bureaus. The governments themselves have set up hubs and places where you can access data sets, and they're slowly beginning to share data sets in Excel. And I know they're small steps, but they are steps forward. However, again, at the local level, none of that is happening. Maybe just a couple more points. The nature of our first two interventions, just to give you a glimpse, there will be more interventions, but the first two that we'll probably be hearing about in the next month are essentially establishing a space, a physical space, and a technical capacity, because that is lacking too, to combine data sets, to train in data literacy and numeracy in Dar es Salaam, and to focus the use of that data on actual questions that are programmatic, questions that pertain to local priorities, and ways to connect the dots between those and the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goals. So, not surprisingly, the nature and the timing of our work, which is outside of the bubble of the MCC organization, as well as the PEPFAR organization. So what's neat is we kind of are innovators to our own organization and try to learn from that as well. The nature and timing of that work is, of course, aligned with the global data revolution, with the decision to acknowledge that things are still unclear, not completely perfect, but we want to do something about it. And we want to do something in a space that has been disproportionately ignored until now.
Andrew.
Okay, thanks. So in a room surrounded by so many people doing interesting things on the practitioner side, I wanted to start by thinking, for my part, by thinking a little bit about what it is that the academic research community and the research community more broadly is trying to achieve in development, and how I think that new opportunities in emergent kinds of data expand the possibilities, and there are some instances in which that's happened. So I think in the academic community, before there was a data revolution, or maybe the data revolution hasn't arrived just yet, there was a credibility revolution. So in terms of what people have been focusing on in the development research community, since the late 90s, early 2000s, people have, with the rise of the running of randomized controlled trials to evaluate social programs, people have really focused on this question of sort of trying to understand what are the impacts of social programs. And there's a couple elements to that. So we want to understand sort of whether things are working. We want to understand for whom they are working. And we want to understand why they are working as well. And those are the kinds of lessons that allow us not just to say this thing was a good idea in some place, but is it likely to work when we advocate for its use someplace else? Because we know that academics and experiments and research studies will only be in a limited number of places. We want to make good policy advice about the portability of those results and those programs into new settings. So I think that against that background, I think that the sort of new possibilities in terms of data offer at least three kinds of improvements in the way that we might, or potential areas for transformation in the way that we go about doing that business. And I think that those areas in particular are the way that programs are targeted. So we're learning a lot about how better to target programs using new kinds of data. How those programs are designed, so programs that we study, thinking about social programming, a lot of those have the use of data built into them, and that is part of the intervention which we're interested in studying. And then thinking about how we measure the impacts of those programs after the fact, and I'll want to give some examples of each. So thinking about targeting, I think it's worthwhile to remember just how cumbersome is kind of business as usual. So when we think about the targeting of anti-poverty programs, the classic thing in sort of international development would be to take something like the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Surveys, and you have consumption modules that try to figure out how poor people are based on how much food and other things they eat. These things, I've administered them, I've forced people to, or asked people to do them, I should say, and it's painful to watch and painful to participate in it as well. They take hours. This is how we figure out kind of where the poor people are and where we should target these programs. It's an incredibly expensive way of going about doing business. We now see research in support of lighter weight, softer touch ways of finding out who are likely beneficiaries. So I work a bit with an NGO called Give Directly that does kind of direct cash transfers to people in poor countries. In Kenya, where they started out, they use satellite data to choose the villages in which they work, because it turns out that in Kenya, a good way to proxy who was poor is who has a thatched roof versus who has a metal roof. So you can look on a satellite and see where the shiny places are, and those are the ones you probably don't want to go to, and you look for the not so shiny places, and that's probably a good place to put your program. So you can think about sort of using new kinds of data with good proxies for who are your target populations. And I think in the process, we're learning a little bit about what's important to measure in order to do that. So a common misconception has been that if we wanted to cut down this 3-hour consumption module, we should figure out, well, what are the most important things to people? What do they consume the most of? So poor people, eat lots of rice, so we should ask, keep the rice questions. But that actually doesn't tell you very much about who's poor, because it turns out that poor people and rich people eat about the same amount of rice. It doesn't change that much. But there are new things and new kinds of data which inform the question of who's poor, because they really vary over the income spectrum. So things like, it turns out, how much money people spend on their cell phones is a really good proxy for how well off people are in lots of different countries. And so validating and figuring out, what are these good proxies and how might we better target social programs is an area where I think the research community works with the practitioner community to figure out sort of some useful things. Second point I mentioned is that new kinds of data are facilitating the design of new programs to study. So I'll give you one example from my own work. So I work on the delivery of social services in East Africa primarily as one of the questions that I'm interested in. And there's a big problem in, let's say, primary schools in Uganda, to cite one. Right? So if you go into a primary school in Uganda on any given day, 29% of teachers aren't there. Right? Teacher absenteeism is a first-order problem for the effective delivery of social services. And it's really costly to send traditional inspectors out to figure out what's going on. There's 3 of them per district. They've got 200 schools, and nobody gives them a budget for gas for their cars, so they're not going anywhere. So we worked together with some folks at Makerere University, the main university in the capital, who had designed a platform for submitting reports about the presence of teachers in the schools, which could be used by parents or teachers or other kind of stakeholders there in the community. And we built a study around the idea of, well, let's see whether we could attach monetary or non-monetary incentives to this locally generated data and see if that might move the needle on the question of teacher presence, and see if that might even help you, at the same time, would that give you a well-informed or a completely biased picture of sort of where these absenteeism problems are severe. And I think this is, not what governments would normally want to do. Normally, they want to have, verifiable information on the basis of which to think about these kinds of rewards. So this is a bit sort of, outside the norm. This program, implemented at its best, cut absenteeism rates by about 1/3. So, these kinds of user-generated things can do a lot of good. So I think that's a second sort of area. And then a third area that I'd highlight is the question of measurement. So how do we understand whether our programs are doing good or not? And I think here, too, there are a lot of interesting new kinds of data, naturally occurring transactions, especially as the economies that we study become more and more digital, that give us the opportunity to study impacts in ways that we couldn't have before. So an example comes from Rwanda, where in response to a natural disaster, some researchers asked the question of sort of, where are the networks of social support? And this has been an important question because we want to understand how should we design insurance for these kinds of problems. Well, how you should design that depends on where people normally get their support. So some researchers at the University of Washington and the University of Oxford put together data from the cell phone companies looking at cash transfers over mobile money to look at where, from where are transfers coming to support people in the wake of natural disasters. And so you have these really interesting outcome measures that occur from natural transactions that all of a sudden open up new possibilities of kind of studying the outcomes in which we're interested. So I think we can look at kind of those kinds of things. We can also think of new ways to, so also on measurement, we can think of new ways to assess impacts. So you don't always have to do a big randomized controlled trial. When governments increasingly implement programs, governments and other people increasingly implement programs based on good and big data with nice big samples where there are sharp cutoffs in eligibility, and you can look at people who are on one side or the other. There are funny tax rules in Rwanda that I'm studying with a colleague, Neda Issa here, for example, that look at this kind of question. So I think we can measure in entirely new ways. And something that perhaps, my last point, something that's not come up too much is to think about, well, this question of who and where are the people who are the ideal beneficiaries for our programs. Typically, we focused on need, so we think about who is really poor. But there's a nice confluence of the research agenda in sort of computer science on prediction with the study on causality, or the emphasis on causality in the academic community, where predicting who will be the people who benefit the most is a very different question than trying to figure out who's poor, and has potential large gains on the table for understanding how to efficiently target social programs. Because of course you do want to be pro-poor in that targeting, but you also don't want to throw money at places where it's not going to have any impact. And I think there's a nice intersection of those sets of methods from across these disciplines that's made possible by the new kinds of data out there.
Okay, so there's another 6,000 topics on the table to start with. I'm gonna actually go into the first order question on this, is because when each of you are talking, we're talking about different types of data. So let's just start with the question number one. What is data? I mean, what are we really talking about? Because sometimes we're talking about frontline SMS, which is user-generated data. Sometimes we're talking about government data that you have and what kinds of data are you using to work with populations. We're talking about designing. So to each of you, what do you mean and what do you think about when you think about data, and how did those start combining together? Because user-generated with, and Andy gave us a couple of really good examples of this, user-generated with public data sets, how do you start thinking about those pieces? So let me start with you. Sean,
Sure.
go ahead.
So SMS is actually a data channel. So we all think of it as the messages that we get on our phone, but it's actually a whole band of spectrum that is put out by wireless towers. So we have a bunch of actually particulate matter sensors, which are environmental sensors that are robots running on messaging, because we're able to pull them outside of Wi-Fi access, grid power access. So we're able to get data kind of beyond the divide. And I think that that's, when I think of data, I'm thinking of, I just, actually, you know, I don't really think of data, if I'm totally honest. Like I think of, because it's like one of those things is like talking about air, or like without talking, or like water without talking about hydrodynamics. Like all of the decisions are so contextual and so linked to value chains, whether they are supply chains or consent chains or output indicators or outcome indicators. You know, there are so many different contexts for it that I actually think looking at data as a single thing in many ways kind of generalizes the conversation in ways where people who really agree find themselves disagreeing. So I think about user-generated data, for example, very differently than I would think about machine-generated data, and like historical data from governments is a whole separate set of things. So I would actually, I think it was Brian, I might actually take the data.period.because period. I might just take data out and just have the conference called because. You know, and look at use and causality and kind of really digging in on the context, I think really matters.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Jed?
To build on Sean's comments, as I was unable to do last time, I might, to quote The Wizard of Oz, call the conference because of the wonderful things it does. But our job is to look behind the proverbial curtain and think of data as a series of activities, is what I would say. I mean, to answer your question directly, data is information about the world rather than assumptions or opinions or views about the world. And I like my example from The Economist, and thank you to whoever tweeted it, because it's just one piece of information that was measured somewhere. Another way to look at data would be to call it anything you could put in an Excel file. And that creates a series of very interesting challenges, because when it comes to things like stories, anecdotes, more qualitative data, photos, geo coordinates, you may or may not be able to put that in an Excel file. But if you could, then you could post it to GitHub, and then you could get it more shareable, and then you could make it more massive, because that's what we're here to talk about. But my final answer will be that it's sort of an eye of the beholder issue, because to use the great grid that Andrew just laid out, whether we're planning based on need or what we can view, whether we're designing a program or whether we're measuring, we're bringing so many sets of values and assumptions that there's almost no such thing as, data's a little bit like that tree in the forest. Like, everyone's eardrums hear it differently. It creates a different perception to a seismic measurement than it does to an artist who's trying to, you know, draw a fallen tree. And there are so many assumptions built into how we look at, plan for, seek, collect, and relate data that it's highly useful to think of it as not really there.
Nastya?
So I would rename the conference as Data for Local Impact, because again, it's not data for data's sake, it's about results, about outcomes. So, and to that end, the type of data that we talk about really needs to be fit for purpose to the questions and what it is that you're trying to address with that data. That said, I guess in the context in which we're operating and in the context of this partnership that I mentioned, we're envisioning touching upon data in the areas of HIV, AIDS, and broader health, of course, given the nature of the partnership and it being with PEPFAR. Gender equality, because again, to this point of trying to put disproportionate effort where maybe there is insufficient attention, we want to focus on those kinds of data, as well as economic growth, because again, it's about trying to make a change and an impact. You know, in terms of the other aspects of this, so of course we're talking a lot about geo-reference data, data visualizations. We're also talking about more real-time data that is very important in the health space and in any kind of emergency response situation. All of those are part of the type of data that we expect to be able to come across. But the purpose, again, of the partnership and the focus is about local impact and changing and rather exposing country-based stakeholders to better habits around decision-making, to actually look at data before prioritizing, to tie the amount of budgets assigned to some of these localities that you mentioned so that they're proportional to the problematics in the area, to whether there is high teacher absenteeism, to whether there are high rates of HIV/AIDS infection, and to empower, again, going back to my initial statement, to somehow bring on board the beneficiaries so that they help close that feedback loop to let either the donors or the governments or whoever the service providers are know when there is a breakdown in that loop.
So I'm afraid I don't have a new name for the conference, but so
Good.
let me say.
We're already running out of names.
So I guess I would echo the kind of broad tent view of what kinds of things constitute data and constitute useful data. Maybe let me just draw one distinction, which I think comes up in a bit in my own work or from the perspective where I sit, which is I think that in some sense you can draw a distinction, and it's not quite as sharp as this, but between data which are objective or are taken at least as sort of traditional ends in and of themselves. Right? So we do some work on like student enrollment. We think we know what student enrollment is. Or we do some work on tax, and we think we know that we want to build government's fiscal capacity. So have they brought people into the tax system? Right? The end is, in that sense, is measured well and perfectly, and people will accept that the money that comes in the door is actually the outcome that you're interested in. So you can measure some of these things directly. I think where a lot of the interesting possibilities are, however, are in data which aren't kind of anchored in this absolute truthful adherence to the thing that we care about from a policy perspective. So a lot of this user and client generated stuff, you have to do a little bit of extra work to convince people that this is something that is, reflects a reality on the ground that's not being gamed, that we can attach serious policy decisions to. And I think those are often important and winnable conversations, but I think that distinction is something that we should worry about. And I think especially as we open up to these kind of new and more user-driven kinds of data, there is a little bit of this kind of Heisenberg uncertainty principle that comes up here, right? Where once you start using the data for new purposes, and now you're measuring stuff in order to assign what who's going to get what, the way the data come in may change in response to that. And one thing that we have to be mindful of is, what are the incentives for the people who are doing the measurement when we're in this kind of more user-driven side of things.
So all of you kind of raise interesting questions, and the reason I asked you this data question is because I think it's important that we think about what data we're talking about and what we're trying to solve for. And I think each of you talked about this. So I'm going to pick up on the last point that you made, Andrew, which is about kind of integrity of data. And this was also talked a little bit about in the last panel. Actually, it was talked about quite a bit in the last panel too, which is when we think about data being used differently, look, we're all good at gaming the system. That's human nature. We game the system for everything. So once we start collecting a certain type of data, someone's going to start gaming it. And that's just the way the process works. But how do we think about this integrity of data? How do we think about it as we're using user-generated data plus combining it with public data sets? What is this question around integrity, and what is it we should be thinking about? And I know, Sean, you've thought a lot about this, and we talked about this a little bit on the phone, so I'd love just your thoughts on this too, and from where you've been sitting.
Yeah. I'm not going to rename the panel though this time. No, it's so I think that for data integrity, so it was really interesting even to hear Andrew's description, right? Because one of the things that I took from it is like, man, I would totally build a shiny roof if I lived in Rwanda, right? Because there's more money in that, and taking proxy indicators have value judgments embedded, and I think that when you get into social engineering systems, you stop being able to say that is a neutral data point or that data point has integrity. As it may be a proxy But whether or not your roof is a valuable and useful proxy and how long it's a valuable and useful proxy raises very serious ethical questions about the way that we use public funding, public resources, private funding, and private resources. And it's ultimately, two really quick things that I think live in this entire conversation that I feel like I don't necessarily hear a huge amount about all the time is one, I don't know how many of you know the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is essentially, given no other intervening force, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It is basically, it's about centralization of power. It's actually, I think the name comes from the Bible, but it's mostly a social research concept. And one of the things that happens in these technology spaces, we are absolutely materially making proxy decisions about the Matthew effect, right? And looking at how it is, when we're talking about centralization, one of the things that we find in data integrity, the vast majority of the governmentally held statistics are held at the national level. In my work, the vast majority of our work is bridging the rural and urban divide. And so Nairobi, in many ways, is a lot more like Baltimore than it is like Kisumu, which is just a couple hundred miles away. And Baltimore is a whole lot more like Nairobi than it is like, say, Salisbury, Maryland, where I grew up, which is a whole different conversation. But the point is just to say that, in a lot of cases, the frames that we're using come from embedded assumptions about our data collection and gathering capacity, and they perpetuate those assumptions. And it's one of those things that, I think your comment was exactly right. We have a problem, I think, where most of our data conversations focus on input data and output data. And we don't necessarily enunciate the rules of the game because of exactly the tension that you bring out, which is, as soon as I know the rules of the game, I'm going to optimize for the game and get the best direct cash grant I can with a metal roof, right? And so there's a fundamental kind of core tension in looking at data integrity systems and thinking, is the goal equity, or are we providing selective benefit based on a proxy indicator, and what is the research, what is the social engineering philosophy that underpins the way that we form proxies and the way that we employ proxies? And as a standalone kind of data processing challenge, that stuff is really interesting. When it's applied to social engineering, when it's applied to disaster response, when it's applied to public service delivery, there's a whole second layer of questions about who are we favoring, why, how, and how does that kind of relate to all of the frameworks that should apply?
Andy, I'm going to go to you next because I think this is directly related to some of the research you're doing, but also just the questions that Sean raises.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I entirely echo Sean's point. So I think people respond to incentives, and you set those incentives when you decide what are the proxies. And you hope that these proxy means tests are well designed. So you'd expect. So maybe people would. If you had to have a thatched roof in order to get this, because that made it look like you were poor, you might expect people would kind of take the roof off before people came around or whatever, right? Because that's even within villages, that was the targeting criteria. Maybe the surprising thing is once they got the transfers, what did people do with the money? Well, the number one thing that people spent the money on in this Give Directly evaluation was building roofs, actually, right? So, in addition to people gaming the incentives to get the transfers, it seems like there's also been some kind of signaling of norms, right? So you're telling people what's important. You're saying, look, here's a measure of status, and I'm conveying that by what I'm choosing as my proxy measure. And so everybody responds to that and says, oh, well, now that we know that, the cool people in town had metal roofs, that's what we'll spend money on. It turns out that actually a metal roof is a pretty good investment because you spend a lot of money on the maintenance of a thatch roof. So maybe there's an economic case for this. But I think it's entirely possible that we're signaling norms when we choose these proxies. So, what can we do about that, I think, is a really hard question, because we have this opportunity to use these naturally occurring sources of data to target better. We anticipate they'll be gamed, and in a way we have to keep coming back and checking, do these still map on to the underlying and less gameable things that we care about? So I think that's where this kind of iteration between the development of proxies and then kind of staying one step ahead of the incentives by coming back and seeing to what extent they're being gamed is a challenge.
And sorry, just because other people have smarter things to say, but one really interesting opportunity here is to involve the communities of practice in the formation of proxies and the formation of indicators.
The local communities, or the communities of practice, or both.
Both.
I mean, ideally both. But I certainly think that one of the things that's really interesting is the portability of assumption that comes from geographically removed proxy formation. So like if you are saying the roof is the indicator and you are shipping that as a norm, which maybe it was embedded already, maybe it wasn't, like maybe the community has a better indicator.
So actually, I'm not going to ask both of you the same exact question. I'm actually going to shift a little bit to based on this conversation to say, so where is citizen voice in this? Do we take in, and Ignacio, you started with it a little bit, of like, where do we get user input? And are we asking the question we want to receive the answer to, or do we actually know what the users want? And how are we thinking about that? And Jed, as you think about this from how you help people design data, how do we think about citizen input? Because we all keep wanting to say we're doing this for citizens, but are the citizens involved?
No, I'm so glad you're asking that question, because I really feel that that is still the biggest mistakes that invariably all of us make, whether we're in the policy space or in the development space or governments, that we make decisions on behalf of others without fully understanding the context and how those things play themselves out. So in a way, I think the interesting question here is if you were able to connect to some of the neighbors of that individual with the thatched roof, would you have gotten an additional piece of information that would have better helped you in designing or monitoring the deployment of that program? And to me, I think what's also important about this is if you go back to the point that we should be looking at the ecosystem as a whole, those questions of data integrity, usability of the data, it's really about making sure that there are checks and balances. It's even connected to the Matthew effect in some ways, I feel, because this broadening and separation between the haves, the have-nots, the ones that can access increasingly complex, sophisticated, real-time data, and those that, as I said, for whom the data revolution doesn't even exist because they don't even have a cell phone. There's a need to start filling those gaps and helping, preventing from that divide from increasing even more to the point where it will be much harder to connect the last mile. So I think that in the development space, the citizen or beneficiary voice should be the number one. And so really, rather than beginning to get into our own heads, into our own systems, into our own data, the first step is to go back to the communities. And an example that immediately also comes to mind for me is in fact a community in Nairobi, the Kibera community, which is an underserved community. And for a long time, there have been attempts to invest in improving, the situation in that community. There are security issues, lack of lighting, a huge number of problems related to health and underservicing. But one of the things that seems to have provided a glimmer of hope is, in fact, using data and talking to the community members themselves about their own priorities. What are your priorities first? What are the problems that you're trying to solve? And getting them to help provide ideas about where the lights would be most effective in helping address some of the security issues. And then incorporating that and using data to help drive that process forward. So going back to number one, which is what is the stakeholder input into this? What are the beneficiaries' needs and priorities? And then supporting them through our programs and policies, whether we're government, national or subnational, NGOs, development agencies. Data then becomes a tool to make that more effective.
I like what you just said, because you're sort of creating a collaborative design model, because we face just a very fundamental international development paradox, and frankly, right, a paradox anywhere where there's experts and beneficiaries, or concentrations of money and intention, and less money and more distributed, lives being lived day to day. When I worked at a Natural Resource Governance Institute, which was then called Revenue Watch, I remember being stunned when someone explained to me, well, you can't just, this is about the extraction of oil and minerals from the ground, and whether that money is properly benefiting the communities that live above the resources themselves. And my boss said to me, my boss Karin, about whom I was talking about with Sonal, said to me, well, remember that because this wasn't my field, remember that even if Iraq or some country had all the money and time in the world, they would still need the international companies to give them the support they needed to get this out of the ground and move it around the country. They would still need China or Norway or the US or Brazil or whomever to work on that. So you can't simply say always, when it comes to these kind of informatics questions and observational questions, leave that group, leave the so-called users, so-called beneficiaries to themselves. So instead, what I would advocate is we need to move from a traditional model of program design, which is plan with the best expertise you have available and the best data you already have, embed a series of assumptions, hopefully not too deleterious, into your design, deliver, and then seek the feedback loop. But instead, rather than thinking of it as a line with an arrow at the end that loops back, to think of it as a coil that from the design stage all the way along the way is seeking, more humbly, seeking co-design and feedback at every stage. Some people call that an agile model. There are some assumptions around that too that don't always apply from the tech world to the development world, as certain consultants and vendors might advise you they do. A last point I'll make is going back to the incentives point, which is that as we look at how are our incentives built into our program design, our data collection, our data delivery, and our measurement, what's our incentive to get the next cycle of funding from whoever we're getting it from, to have the running room of 100 million. One of the amazing things about that is that you can co-design what your accountability looks like, being informed by what you learn in your first month and in your second month and in your third month, before somebody like the World Bank or one of the big donors, or the government, one of the donor governments comes knocking and says, well, we needed you to have gotten 100,000 Twitter likes within a year, or we needed you to have 100,000 new kiosks built to deliver information or to deliver diapers, whatever it happens to be, or syringes within a year, because those measurements may turn out to be totally inapplicable. They may be vanity metrics. Google vanity metrics, there's some good work being done in our community around that right now.
So we're going to open it up to questions. Please wait for the mic to come to you, because it'll be easier for us to hear. And feel free to raise your hands, and somebody will come get you the question. And if you wouldn't mind telling, just kind of giving your name too.
Hi, my name is Caroline. I want to thank you all for such an amazing panel, and also shout out to the microbiologist, because I'm a biology major and working with large sets of data, so real talk. So one of the things I think that you guys really addressed really well is how the value of any decisions made based on data are really only as valid as the data set itself. And so I thought it was really great that we examined sort of the almost fleeting value of proxy indicators, as they may change over time. But one thing I wanted to ask was, how do you anticipate blind spots in the data? For example, with much user-generated data, it's based on text, but a large swath of the people who live in the developing world can't read or write. So how do things like illiteracy create blind spots in your data, and how do you correct for those blind spots? Thank you.
Take that?
Sure,
Sean?
I love that one. So 2 things. The first is the value, just to provide an alternative, the value of a data set is very often deeply correlated to the ability of an institution to hear what is reflected in that data set. And one of the things that is really interesting about the institutional feedback loop conversation is that there are a huge number of platforms for citizen voice. There are more platforms now than there ever have been. But we haven't developed institutions that necessarily internalize them well. So like the White House's We the People petitioning site is amazing in terms of what it welcomes, but it doesn't guarantee any outcome. And so like if what you get is a letter that tells you the rote government position, like that wasn't a good use of 100,000 signatures. Just to say, like, I think it's like when we're talking about all of this, in terms of blind spots and in terms of what the value of a particular body of data is, it's related to how it's used. The blind spots piece, so in any research method, hopefully you would A/B test a few things. And I think that one of the things that happens is that we're not very good at building systems of equivalence. So like if we interact over voice, I couldn't necessarily tell you what the legal value of that is as compared to if we were interacting over text messaging, or if we were interacting over email, or if we were interacting over contracts. And so one of the real lags on institutional listening is actually building systems that equate different signaling behaviors from people in different formats. And so looking at the source of citizen-generated data, in an ideal world, what we're doing is we're comparatively testing voice and text and images and emoji and sensors and like whatever it is that you can get people to engage with. I think that very often, unfortunately, the kind of funding and market model really focuses organizations on single hypotheses and single platform interaction, where most relationships are conducted over multiple platforms. So I think the lens of how we measure and understand what works in a particular community is a little askew. And I also think that despite like the hours of time that people spend saying that we're not looking for a silver bullet, the fact that we continue to invest in single approach interventions, single approach problems, single approach solutions, single platform technologies, those are all really clear indicators that like, we're not looking for a silver bullet, but if you find one, we'll fund it. And so, I think that there is how do we invest in building equivalent understandings across different data sources and different technologies and different social engineering approaches. And when we understand them as an equivalence, I think a lot of the blind spot problem goes away.
Andrew, do you want to take?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to jump in. So a couple things. One is, I guess, maybe this is part of the reason that traditional survey research and the other complementary methods shouldn't be declared dead just yet, is that we do need to figure out how broad is access to these technologies and how what is the share of people who are participating in these things, so that at least we can say something about who's been incorporated and who's not, so we're aware of the boundaries of our understanding to a greater extent than we would be otherwise. The other thing, I really like this point about sort of institutional listening, right? So, in a way, the constraint is you have to think about how to structure the data that comes in so that the right people can make use of it. And in many contexts, especially where you're talking about influencing governments at high level, that's a really sharp trade-off, right? The way that you can present information, it requires you to put a lot of structure on the way that people engage with it, and that may make it harder for some people to get involved. But that's not always the case, in fact, right? So there are some instances where you're interested in sort of the agency of the people themselves who are providing this information, and those might be cases where this trade-off doesn't bind in quite the same way. And we did an earlier experiment on sort of holding schools and teachers to account in Uganda that actually sort of tackled a bit this problem. We had a technocratically designed, so this was about community monitoring through scorecards about the schools. We had this technocratically designed, best case, gold standard NGO and ministry-driven scorecard for schools, right? That we thought was, the technocrats in the room thought this is what matters, what everybody should measure. This is what will really drive results in the school. And this would be disseminated back to stakeholders, and it'd go up to the districts who manage these schools. Then we had another version that was kind of like the kumbaya version, where we didn't really tell them what to measure at all. We let people decide in what format did they want to provide information about what was going on in their school, what were the important things and whatnot. And so then we ran a kind of a horse race. Which of these was going to have bigger impacts on things like inputs of teacher presence and things like learning outcomes in the schools. And the technocratic stuff got completely wiped out, right? So that participatory thing, the act of engaging with it, actually had much greater impacts than what we thought was the better measurement. And so I think there are going to be instances where this trade-off isn't quite as binding, and where there might be real gains to kind of letting go a little bit of how you think you should structure the data.
I would just
questions?
give give Caroline a very shorthanded answer as the comms guy. Go and ask. go into that community and find out how they're already trading information about what works and doesn't work, even if it turns out to only be over tea at 2 local cafes.
Seeing a lot of hot nodding heads here. Next question?
Just so everyone knows, if you don't get a chance to ask your question, all of the Twitter handles for both of our panels are listed on your program, so feel free to tweet at them using the hashtag.
Yeah, Brian Pagels from Forum One. I wanted to follow up on some of this thread about kind of feedback and expert opinion versus kind of what beneficiaries are looking for. What happens if the disconnect or the difference in opinion is much more dramatic than, say, the example you just cited? What if the disconnect is something as extreme as, are we addressing the right problem, or is the entire proposed solution or design something beneficiaries want versus experts saying this is what you should want? What do you do in a scenario like that where you have completely conflicting data and opinions?
Agnieszka, you want to take that?
No, I mean, I think that's a great question, and hopefully you're doing it in a context or with an organization that allows you to go back to the drawing board if there's that much of a disconnect. Because from my perspective, if there is that much of a disagreement, it's a non-starter. You really shouldn't be implementing interventions that don't have the buy-in of the beneficiaries or the local context. That's a recipe for disaster. And I can't tell you how many times I've also seen examples of small or mid-scale or large-scale projects that involved, I don't know, putting in place a well that was just designed externally, and then a year later the well breaks down. Nobody in the community knows how to fix it. Sustainability is gone. And then it gets to be more complex from that. So I think I would assume that if there is that much of a discrepancy, go back to the drawing board and to the co-design, because Jed is absolutely right. It's a process of taking the conversation to the local level where it's happening, and jointly determining what the question actually really is, how it's perceived. Perception and reality is a very fine line sometimes. And then how to collaborate on the ultimate solution. And it may be a blending, it may be a lowering of the technology, it may be providing something much simpler, but that is consistent with the local custom, is accepted, etc. I think I'll take this opportunity to also connect this to our sustainable development goals context here. We just recently adopted these as a planet. It's the first time that we're trying to make a cohesive joint goals that are that specific and that far-reaching. But at the end of the day, it's not those goals as they're listed out with 144 or so more targets. It's what happens at the local village level that is a local priority, whether it's access to their water or whether there's the presence of a particular health facility within a walkable distance. That's the roll-up of the impact that will either nudge things forward or not. So I know I sound like a broken record, but you have to go back to the local level, to the stakeholders there. And I know it's harder, it's slower, it does not fit in the context of the broader timelines related to budgets that even agencies like the one that I work for need to in some ways be under the mercy of, but that's the reality.
Jed, you're consulting to a lot of these organizations. How are you helping them think through? Are we even asking the right questions? And what happens if we aren't?
That's sort of what I was about to ask about, because I know Brian has been in this situation. I assume Sean has, and I've certainly been in a situation where someone, whether a partner, a client, an organization, has an idea of what to do and what the intervention will look like, or what the website will look like, or what the data strategy will look like. And it's very, very important. I trust best the consultant who tells me no when I'm asking them to do something, who says, we can't do that and here's why, and then we can have a discussion. But I think it can be very hard to say when there's $10 million from the World Bank or from the Omidyar Network on the line, or from the Gates Foundation, Podshape Gates Foundation. So the question becomes, and this is something that all of us in the room can think about, when can you say no or wait to serve as a proxy rather than seeking proxy indicators for something you can't know because you're not on the ground, to educate yourself enough or to empower yourself enough to be a proxy resistor and to, if not an insurgent, and say, wait, the design of this program, the design of this grant, the design of this research project, not to mention the places where Brian and I more often work, the design of this web strategy, the design of this digital measurement strategy or mobile/blog strategy, whatever it happens to be, is ill-conceived because there's a lack of literacy. To use Caroline's example, I heard a great example recently where they were going to measure health intervention better over time by getting the thumbprint of the rural workers, and 6 months later they would come back and they had these great thumbprint scanners that they had been donated from somewhere. The workers they were measuring were bamboo workers. It's the one thing a bamboo worker doesn't have after a few years, a thumbprint. So don't bring a fax machine to a beach party. Take the time to find things out, and if you don't know, take your best guess and say, hey, wait, maybe even though the grant deadline is coming up, or even though we have the program officer from that foundation coming in tomorrow, don't just ask questions to your beneficiaries, ask questions to the people further up the value chain controlling the money and the decision making, because sometimes they will never have the chance to ask the person in the village.
Just so you know, this audience not everybody knows what a fax machine
I was
is.
gonna say, don't bring a fax machine anywhere. Like, there's just, come on, man.
Sean, I'm short, so sometimes I can use them.
Locally appropriate technology, ladies and gentlemen. I think the one thing that's coming out, though, and I think one thing is really important to recognize, is that there's a market here. That anytime you have revenue streams and procurement models, like, this is a very real market. And right now, the market is not incredibly well designed to function in iterative design environments. And regardless of what part of that you're taking, or which iterative design, whether it's feedback or indicator or local consultation, doing this well costs more than doing it badly in the short term, and ideally costs less in the long term. But you have to have a longer time horizon on your investment from the funder perspective, and we have to be willing to challenge that funding model as a community, I think, to get the results, to get the kind of design results that we're proud of.
So we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask each of you one final question. What do you want people to take away from today? And if you were just leave 2 comments, what would they be? So I'll start with you, Andrew.
So I guess I would say that from the research perspective, our ability to learn about how and why things are working is sort of really transforming as new kinds of data become available. And that those are really serious opportunities. I think that there are still important gaps in the kinds of data that we're collecting and blind spots that result from that. So things like higher frequency data in developing countries are really important. There are instances, for example, of there's a famous, in some circles, a famous book called about the financial diaries. It asks people to record on a daily basis kind of what were they spending, saving, taking out, and whatnot, right? This completely changes the picture of how you think about the financial situation of poor people, right? So people weren't just poor with no money in their bank account. They were lending some days and borrowing some days, and there were all these flows going back and forth. So I think at the same time as we have all these new opportunities, there are still some gaps, and the opportunity to pick up new kinds of data that are at a more fine-grained level, that are higher frequency. I think there's still a lot that can be learned, especially as we see this growth in the number of these transactions that are digital in nature, and so can be brought in that way.
From my perspective, so I think, again, while clearly there's a need for more data, more sophisticated tools, more opening of data, I would argue that the key message here is to get a greater proportion, especially in the international development context, of individuals to actually use the data that is there for their decision making. So to do more of the things that we are even guilty of here, to not keep data sets to themselves or information, to share it, combine it, use it, and uncover potentially some quality issues with that data as well. I think the other key message here is listen to the local level and input and incorporate that into the design of any investments or interventions that are made. And last but not least, since we're talking about a data ecosystem with so many different interconnected looping parts, there is a role for everyone. And that's also why I was really thrilled to see that, that Georgetown is bringing us together, because it'll take partnerships, it'll take collaborations, and different groups and individuals completing different parts of the puzzle.
I'd start by going back to what I said before. Let's stop outsourcing the thoughtful design work. Let's take the time to educate ourselves enough to co-design with beneficiaries, with the people who are going to be using the results of our work, even if they're just down the hall. And that sometimes includes asking harder questions to the people who are telling us the design that they've walked in with an assumption, the assumptions behind their instructions. And the other thing I would say is just to remember that you may think you have peaches, but you might have apples and oranges. So work very hard to check on interoperability and comparability. Just because it's all there doesn't mean that it's telling the story you'd like it to tell.
Now I'm struggling to follow the fruit thing. So I guess if there are two things, like the first thing for me would be every information relationship, whether it's explicit or not, is a financial relationship, it's a power relationship, it's a contract relationship, and it's a technology relationship. Every single information exchange that we have has elements of those four things embedded. And so it's very difficult to have conversations about it when we're not supplying sustainable revenue, when we're not applying good ethical and legal principles, when we're not building dispute resolution and community consultation and building in the kind of things that you normally see in a contract. The technology and data ecosystem that we're building is getting good right-ish, but we're not bringing all of those pieces together, and the pieces that we're missing out are the ones that are creating the divides today that we'll have to fix tomorrow. And so I think, being really holistic about how we look at information relationships, whether we think of them as technology relationships or data relationships, is really important. And the second part of that then is that it's not an entirely zero-sum game, but there's a lot. We are ultimately talking about how we allocate resources and how we make decisions that engineer different and better societies. And it's really, really important to recognize that the vast majority of the decisions that we make, the vast majority of the times that we say, let's not let good be the enemy of perfect, is the time that we make a decision that disadvantages someone that we end up kind of lamenting later. And then the last thing that I will say to end on a more positive note is that what's happening here, what's happening in this room and in this new institute, is one of the only opportunities I've seen, and an incredibly exciting opportunity to really dig in and build a better engine and a better machine, a better institution around being an advocate, a research center, around developing what better practice looks like, and communicating it and adapting it to the institutional structures that will need to hear it and listen and adapt along the way. And so, as a plug, I guess, I would really recommend that people look at this event as a starting point, but also at this institution and this group of people as the beginning of a community that will hopefully be able to really dig in and provide solutions that we can all be really proud of, and not leave people behind as the data revolution evenly distributes. I'm sorry.
We're going to have apples, oranges, and peaches now at the even distribution. Andrew, Sean, thank you, and thanks to all of you for participating in this panel. I think what you hear from both the first panel and the second panel is that there's a very rich conversation as to how we think about moving forward on data and what are the ways of talking about this. But more importantly, in this conversation, I want to take away is how global the conversation is, because this is not a conversation with boundaries of nationhood. This is a conversation of things moving across boundaries, and we need to be thinking about how do we use international, national, local data in ways that allow us to compare Baltimore to Nairobi, and how do we think about that? So we're not siloing just because there's boundaries of nationhood, but to think about data differently. And the second, which I took away certainly, is static versus dynamic. We tend to create for static spaces. And I think and certainly through this conversation, is that dynamism is constant. And so how do policymakers think about living in a constantly adaptive, dynamic environment, as opposed to creating something for 10 years, going back and researching it, but thinking about this coil, and how are we constantly learning and creating the dynamism that is needed, because the world is moving at such a rapid pace that we need to somewhat keep up with it. And finally, to all of you, keep asking us questions, whether it's via Twitter or the emails that you've gotten. Send us questions, because this is the beginning of a conversation, as Sean put, and this is not the end of a conversation. What we're trying to figure out is what needs to be done, and what's the best place for a place like Georgetown to be taking the leadership in, both from whether it's talking about the ethics of data, whether it's talking about the principles of use of data, but what are the best questions, and then who should we be partnering with? Because this by itself is not a one institution problem. This is a multi-institution, multi-stakeholder problem. So we really do look forward to your input on this. And with that, I think I bring Ed back up here, don't I, to close, or are we closing?
I think so.
Okay. So let me just close and say thank you all for participating. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. But please don't see this as an end. See this as a beginning. And we look forward to more of these. Thank you.